Over the almost 20 years since World of Warcraft's release, there's been numerous changes to the game's zones and areas. The most extensive of these happened with the release of the game's third expansion, the Cataclysm, which removed and updated most of the game's older zones. And while the original version of these areas are still there for players to experience through the 2019 classic version of the game, there is one city whose original version players may never experience again, not even in classic. This is the story of Vanilla WoW's Forgotten City. In the current version of World of Warcraft, the Ruins of Anderhall, or simply Anderhall as it's known by most players, is a low-level questing area which introduces both Horde and Alliance players to the main storyline of the Western Plaguelands. The city is comprised of 3 areas: an Alliance-dominated area to the west, a Horde area in the east, and in its center the main battlefield. Here, Alliance and Horde players alike fight to push the Scourge out in a series of quests that culminate with the player being introduced to the Necromancer Darkmaster Gantling, who is also the final boss of the Skullman's dungeon. While this version has been in the game for 14 years, ever since the pre-patch for the Cataclysm expansion, it's never been considered current content because it was designed for players near level 60, who at the time of the Cataclysm were much more likely to enter Outland instead, where they would gain more experience and better gear. And as a result of this, many players don't even know of this version of Anderhall, even though it's been in the game for a very long time. Going back to World of Warcraft Classic, which is based on the final patch of the game's original 2004 version, often referred to as Vanilla WoW, we see the version of Anderhall that most players are familiar with. Here, the city is much larger, with neither the Alliance nor the Horde having questing hubs or buildings within the area. Instead, these are found outside of the city in the Alliance area called Children Camp, near the border to the Alterac Mountain Zone in the south, and the Horde camp called the Bulwark to the west, bordering with the Undead Starter Zone called Tirisful Glades. Here, high-level players begin Anderhall's main questline, which starts off with the player fighting the Scourge in areas near the city, before pushing into the Ruins of Anderhall, where the final part of the questline has a group of players taking down the Lich named Araj the Summoner, who is a level 61 elite located in the center of the city. After completing this questline, the player gains access to the Skullman's dungeon, which used to require an item called the Skeleton Key, and this is the main reason why high-level players choose to visit the Ruins of Anderhall. At least that used to be the case in the original vanilla version of the game. But in the classic version, which is generally based on a copy of the original vanilla version with a few minor changes, there is actually another reason why players choose to visit Anderhall, and this is because the quest giver Chromie sells the classic exclusive consumable called Chrono Boon Displacer to players who have completed her questline within the city. Chromie, as well as her quests, all of which were related to time travel, were actually also available in the original vanilla version, the only difference being that she didn't sell the Chrono Boon, which is a device that allows the player to suspend and save a few specific buffs, meaning that they won't benefit from them, but crucially, the duration will not tick down either. And the player can then remove the Chrono Boon, releasing the buffs at a time of their choosing, which is usually done during raiding. What most classic players don't know is that Araj the Summoner, who is the main boss of the area, actually used to work differently. Where instead of being a regular spawn, reappearing after a few minutes of a group killing him, he actually used to be a summoned NPC, meaning that he wouldn't respawn on his own. Instead, players had to find and destroy 4 crystals, which were located inside the 4 watchtowers surrounding the city, after which he would finally appear. As each of these crystals were guarded by Skeletal Warders, which is an elite NPC, the summoning itself was usually a group effort, although well-geared players could solo them. This summoning system was only in the game for 5 months, being introduced in patch 1.4 and then removed in patch 1.7, meaning that in the classic version, which is based on patch 1.12, Araj the Summoner spawns just like any other NPC. Going to one of the game's databases, you can still find old comments discussing this short-lived summoning system, and the elite skeletons who used to guard the crystals can still be found within each of the 4 towers. If we go back even further to World of Warcraft's very beginning, we see the original version of Anderhall, which used to be in the game from its release up until its removal in patch 1.4 in April of 2005. In this version, Anderhall used to look much more like an actual city, with taller buildings compared to the classic version, as well as having a large wall that surrounded the city. The questing environment during this time was overall similar to the classic version, with a few differences. The main one of these being that in the game's very first version, patch 1.1, Chromie as well as the quests she provided weren't yet in the game. But seeing as she was introduced less than 1 month after the game's release, very few players had made it to the high-level zones, and in every region aside from North America, World of Warcraft had not even been released at this time. When Blizzard changed the runes of Anderhall into the version that we know in Classic, their aim was to make the area easy for players to navigate, as well as improving the frame rate while in the area. And by removing many of the structures as well as the city's outer walls, both of these goals were achieved. Although as a consequence of these changes, Anderhall was made to look less like an actual city and more like a destroyed version of a regular town. When the area was changed, many of the NPCs and quest items had their spawn time or location changed, but 2 of them, the Cold Wraith and the Blood Wraith, who used to patrol around the city in its original version, were not to be included as a spawn in the new remade version of Anderhall, meaning that no player has seen these ghosts since the realms went down for maintenance on April 19th, 2005.